Okay, so intensity. When we discuss intensity, so the intensity, there's two primary means by which we can measure intensity. We have absolute means of measuring intensity, and we have relative means of measuring intensity. So absolute measures of intensity are those where we're measuring some hard value. We're taking direct measurements of it. So in a weightlifting context, it might be how much weight are you using for an exercise? If we're running, it's what's your pace look like, or how fast are you running? You know, how high did you jump, or how fast did you move during any kind of exercise? The ways we, even for some aerobic events, we might even use, percentage of max heart rate. We can use things like percentage of max heart rate if we're looking at a cardiovascular training or cardiovascular adaptations. And then kind of like the unifying method of measuring intensity is always going to be time taken to task failure, where we can actually, hey, you're training at some given intensity level, and then we just measure the time it takes you to reach task failure. You no longer continue working at that given intensity any longer, and we can just take that as a measurement, and that kind of unifies things along the force velocity curve. Whether we're moving at lower velocities with higher masses, whether we're doing eccentric dominated training, whether we're doing concentric training, it doesn't matter. We can always use time taken to task failure. Shorter times taken to task failure is always going to be higher intensity training, and longer time to task failure is always going to be lower intensity training. Now, on the other hand, we have what we've referred to as relative means of measuring intensity. So relative means of measuring intensity are often used in the planning phase. So in the planning phase, we might say, and the thing with relative measures of intensity, what we're often looking at there is you often have to have some knowledge of what performance looks like at any given velocity profile. In a weight training context, if we're training at some given tempo, typically we see, tempos ranging anywhere from 1 to 6 seconds. Typically it goes on the shorter end for most people's training. In general, we might say like, we'll ascribe as an intensity, some percentage of your 1 rep max, and we already assume that you're going to be using some moderate training tempo. You're not going to be moving extremely fast. You're not going to be moving intentionally extremely slow. So for the purposes of like, say, hypertrophy or something, we might ascribe, anywhere from 50 to 80% of your 1 rep max is pretty common. Strength training, we might see something anywhere from 60 to 90%. Pretty large windows, but when you see a lot of people write programs, things generally, for the most part, most programs will fall within that range. Likewise, for things like racing or something, we might take a percentage of your race pace. So it might be, we might say, hey, like, take whatever if you're training for a 5-mile run, we might say, hey, take your 5-mile, race pace and, divide that by 80%, and then that's going to be, like the training intensity that you're running at that day. You're going to do 5 miles at 80% kind of deal. And that's kind of where you start to see, especially with events that last for a very long time. Now, it's easy with weight training because a lot of times it's fairly easy for us to plan off of a projected 1 rep max, especially for people that come from kind of a strength training background. We can generally, people that are very good strength coaches can generally ascribe all sorts of intensities to achieve all different kinds of training effects, and they just and they know what those are. Depending on the training effect they're trying to achieve, generally you're going to see coaches that are going to ascribe anything from 0 to 100% of 1 rep max and be able to fine tune those very well to achieve different training effects, whether it's hypertrophy related, endurance related, speed related, etc. But then again, with when we look at a lot of training that occurs in the weight room, in general, it's fairly high intensity training. You very rarely see work intervals that last anything over a couple of minutes. So what we often see when we get into more like endurance training, you never see someone plan their 1 mile run times, or for distance runners, for example, that are running 5+ miles, they're never going to plan their run paces off of, say, their sprint time. They're not going to take what's your maximum sprint velocity, and then we're going to plan our endurance race paces off of that sprint velocity. In those kinds of cases, we often use what's referred to as a modified training intensity scale. So even for sprint specialists, you'll see a lot of times where some sets they'll say, hey, like, run at your 200 meter pace, run at your 400 meter pace, run at do another one at like your 100 meter pace. They'll kind of modify, they'll kind of tell them they don't really use percentages off their maximal race pace kind of deal. So likewise for a lot of endurance athletes, you'll often see people say like, oh, hey, like today you're gonna run 6 miles at like your 8-mile pace, or where you're gonna run 5 miles at your 5-mile pace, you know, where you're gonna run like 70% of your 5-mile pace. So they'll pick some performance metric that they already have knowledge of because, you know, that's the pace that they race with, or that's the event that they're competitive with, and they'll plan their training loads around that value, not necessarily what they would do at the top of the force velocity curve, which would be, you know, their all-out sprint capability. And that kind of highlights like the need for, when we look at training, you know, a lot of times we need to keep, or training for any kind of event, the intensities need to be relevant to the task that you're training for. So you're not going to win a marathon by sprinting all the time. But in general, whenever we get into programming, we're kind of in like the planning phase and outlining generally what that person's training program should look like. We will generally take the simplest version of that is we can always take time taking the task failure. I use that because you can use it across every conceivable exercise. You know, it's very useful, you know, and we're going to get more into that kind of system later and why that's such a simple system to use. You can use it for anything. It helps unify a lot of training, especially in cases where people aren't necessarily very familiar with the training means which they're using. They don't know how to program intensities and whatnot. If you just use time taking the task failure, it makes it very simple, and it helps prevent a lot of overtraining injuries when used appropriately without having to learn a lot of the fine nuances of counting, of having to count reps and how many reps do you have to do at all these different force velocity profiles. That can get very confusing, and it can take a long time for people to learn. But otherwise, in the planning phase, you know, if we are familiar with the person's performance, or we're familiar with the athlete, or we're familiar with the events that we're training for, a lot of times we already have an idea about, okay, like we already know like what the intensities are going to train for, so we're going to pick metrics that we or them already have knowledge of what their performance is, and we're just going to base all our intensities off of those numbers. And then once we have them start running the program, then we generally actually get hard values for what all those relative numbers would be, because whenever we do the relative intensity stuff, a lot of times it's estimates and it's never going to be precise, but once we get them in, you know, start into the training program, you know, they're under the effects of fatigue or what have you, then those numbers are all going to stabilize, then we start progressing things from there. So generally, when we get into the planning phases of any sort of program, no matter what it is, the simplest way to do it is to start from time, because we can unify all training needs under an intensity umbrella through the lens of time taken to task failure. Now, to keep us from having to use a stopwatch for all of our sets, because that's cumbersome and annoying and no one wants to do that, once we do that, we basically take all the exercises, we identify the most relevant metric that we want to keep track of for that exercise, whether it's jump height, velocity, weight lifted, you know, distance ran, what have you. We're going to take the most relevant metric, and usually the one that's the most convenient to track, that correlates very closely with their performance, and we're going to plan their training loads around those values to kind of fine tune things a little bit. And then once they actually get started on the training program and we see what their actual performance on their exercises during the training program is, you know, then we're going to actually get hard values. Everything gets converted over to absolute values, and then we just track their absolute values. And we should generally never really have to go back to relative training values unless we're trying to make changes to the program or we're starting a new program. But as long as we don't change the program, we can always just stay within those absolute values, and then we should never really have to mess with it. So anyways, that's generally like the main ways that we can track intensity. You know, like this, you know, the simple umbrellas, we have time, and then we have the relative metrics of intensity, and then we have the absolute values for intensity. And those are kind of like the primary ways with which we track it. Yeah, so that wraps up our video on intensity. We'll get into volume on the next one.